What object was capable of shaking the foundations of the most sophisticated economy of the 17th century without being a weapon, a plague, or an enemy army? A flower, a simple tulip bulb. The popular story says that in weeks, the rich became beggars and the most prosperous nation was left on the brink of collapse. The bulb supposedly reached outrageous prices. But was it really so? The answer is stranger than you imagine and more useful than any manual. Because what makes this story eternal is not the magnitude of the disaster. 4 centuries later, historians still debate whether it was an economic catastrophe or a great exaggeration. The answer is not a simple yes or no. It is a journey that reveals how the first speculative bubble of modernity was born and why we keep falling into the same trap over and over again. The conventional story paints a picture of collective madness, an entire country risking its savings on showy flowers only to fall into ruin. But the reality is more nuanced, because what happened in Holland was not just the first bubble. It was the first mirror in which capitalism looked at itself and did not like what it saw, and its reflection remains uncomfortably familiar. To understand it, let us travel to the Dutch Golden Age. The Netherlands were the envy of Europe. They controlled the spice routes, the most sophisticated banking, and a fleet larger than England and France combined. Amsterdam, a prominent financial center, where the future was invented daily. Modern capitalism was not born here. It had been gestating since the late medieval period and the mercantilist practices across all of Europe. But Holland was its most shining showcase, and into that breeding ground, an exotic flower arrived, the tulip. It was not native there. It had traveled from the gardens of the Ottoman Empire, where the sultans venerated it. But it was in the Netherlands where it found the perfect ground, a society of merchants that understood the value of scarcity and the power of fashion. It immediately became a status symbol. Having tulips in the garden was much more than gardening. It was a declaration of power, an equivalent of today's luxury car, an unmistakable sign that you had made it. But there was a problem: natural patience. The flowers were fragile and took years to grow from seed. Whoever planted a seed today would not see a profitable flower until years later. That turned any whim into a long-term investment that few were willing to sustain. Everything changed when it was discovered that tulips could grow faster from a bulb. The patience of nature is nothing compared to the impatience of human beings. Overnight, what was scarce was no longer the flower but became the bulb itself. Now, whoever possessed the bulb did not possess a flower. They possessed time, scarcity, and the promise of future beauty. And what is scarce in any market of any era has only one inevitable destiny: the price skyrockets. So the fever began. The tulip, with its streaked and broken colors, became the object of desire for a society that valued rarity above all else. In 1634, tulip mania had spread throughout the country. It was not just a matter for aristocrats. People from various sectors threw themselves into the market. The tulip bulb had become the first purely speculative asset in history, an object whose price was not justified by its usefulness or its beauty, but solely by the collective conviction that someone else would pay more for it tomorrow. What made this mania unique was that, in many cases, the bulbs were bought not to plant them, but to resell them before they sprouted. It was a market of promises, of bets on the future. And that is the essence of every financial bubble. What pushed so many sensible people to participate in something they did not understand? It was not greed. It was something much more powerful and universal: the intolerance of being left behind. Modern psychologists call it herd behavior. Economists, animal spirits. In the 17th century, they did not have those terms. But they knew what it meant to watch your neighbor get rich from something you didn't understand. The worst feeling wasn't losing money, it was missing the party. When everyone around you was talking about impossible fortunes, the pressure didn't come from the market. It came from the uncomfortable silence of someone watching while others got rich. That dynamic is as old as money and as modern as the latest cryptocurrency. Every bubble has a pin, but the pin changes. In 1637, it was a doubt. In 1929, it was a margin call. In 2008, it was subprime mortgages. But the result is always the same. When the music stops, only the chairs remain. What makes Tulip Mania unique is that it was the first time humanity experienced that vertigo. No manuals, no precedents, no one to warn them. And the one for tulips came around February 1637. No political crisis or natural disaster was needed. All it took was for confidence to waver, for doubts to start spreading. That collective hesitation, invisible at first, was the crack. That was the exact moment the music stopped, and as always happens, there were far more people than chairs. Prices began to fall, and by 1638 they stabilized. The chain that held together on the trust that someone would pay more the next day snapped. And when it snapped, it did so the way only things that never had a foundation break. Yet here, the story takes a turn the legend usually overlooks. Modern studies have begun to reassess what actually happened. Yes, there was frantic trading. Yes, incredibly high prices were paid for some bulbs. And yes, those prices collapsed. But the tulip fever didn't reach everything equally. Many people didn't take part in the speculation. And the national trade, as a whole, didn't collapse. So why has the story of tulip mania survived 4 centuries? Why do we keep telling it if perhaps it was more myth than catastrophe? The answer is unsettling, because it serves as a mirror. Because we need to believe that greed has a price, and because each generation believes its tulip is different. The myth of tulip mania has survived because it serves a narrative purpose. It reminds us that the market can punish irrational exuberance, but the reality is more uncomfortable. Sometimes the market doesn't punish anyone. Sometimes the bubble deflates quietly and life goes on. That is what really happened in Holland, and that is what the official story rarely tells. The true legacy of tulip mania isn't a lesson about greed. It's a warning about how easily we confuse price with value. When an asset has no anchor in reality, when its value depends solely on what someone else is willing to pay, the ground is always sand. And in the desert of speculation, the most dangerous mirage isn't the flower, it's the certainty that this time will be different. Every time a market shoots up for no apparent reason, someone invokes tulip mania. But the irony is that most of those who invoke the ghost of Holland don't know the real story. They believe it was a disaster that ruined a country, when in reality it was a far more contained episode. Yet the legend persists because it's more useful than reality. A well-told myth is worth more than 1,000 statistics. The flower changes, the behavior doesn't. Each generation rediscovers its own tulip mania. Florida land, railroad stocks, .coms, cryptocurrencies, NFTs. The mechanics are always the same. First the money arrives, then the story that justifies the money, and then the crowd that no longer needs either the money or the story, only needs to believe it will arrive before the music stops. Tulip mania, more than a systemic collapse of capitalism, was the first great rehearsal of what happens when a crowd decides, for a moment, that gravity doesn't apply to their garden. And that lesson is too valuable to forget. Because in the end, the bulbs will have another name, but the fall, that one, always tastes the same. Markets, just like gardens, only need one winter to reveal what was planted with roots and what was planted without them.